She had no gun, no backup, and according to the contract she signed, no voice in that penthouse. She was the maid. And as she stood there polishing a vintage crystal decanter, she watched a shadow move across the security feed, a breach in the perimeter that Kang Min-jae's high-priced bodyguards hadn't even registered yet. She had maybe 6 seconds before the door burst open. No time to scream, no time to reach the alarm, and certainly no time to explain to a mafia boss why his life was in the hands of the woman who fluffed his pillows. So, she did something that rewrote the rules of his world forever. She didn't hide. She didn't run. She simply waited behind the door with a silk cleaning rag and a heavy glass bottle, and by the time the hit squad realized she was there, they were already dead. But here's the part the underworld still hasn't figured out. Taking out the hit squad was the clean part. The real mess started the moment Kang Min-jae walked in and found Nala standing over the bodies, calmly asking if he took his espresso with 1 sugar or 2. Min-jae is a man who builds his empire on knowing every variable, and Nala was the first variable he couldn't solve. To understand how a ghost from a forgotten war ends up as the silent guardian of Seoul's most feared man, you have to look at the place where it all began. His penthouse wasn't a home. It was a fortress of glass and cold steel overlooking the Han River. It was a place designed for silence, filled with the kind of secrets that get people buried in the foundation of skyscrapers. Min-jae lived in a world of loud threats and heavy artillery. He never realized that the most lethal weapon he ever owned was the one he'd hired to make his bed. Min-jae didn't hire Nala because of a glowing recommendation or a high-priced agency. He had found her name on a crumpled flyer in a neighborhood where even the police preferred to keep their sirens off. He needed someone who wouldn't flinch at the sight of a blood-spattered shirt in the laundry or ask why the trash bags sometimes felt heavier than they looked. He needed a ghost, and Nala, with her deep, unreadable eyes and skin the color of a midnight eclipse, seemed like a woman who had already died once and had no intention of doing it again. For the first 3 months, she was exactly what he expected, furniture that breathed. Min-jae's life was a symphony of chaos, telephones screaming, lieutenants bleeding out on his designer sofas, and the constant, vibrating tension of a war with the Shin clan that was slowly stripping him of his sanity. He would storm through the penthouse, his slicked back hair slightly disheveled and his sharp jawline tight with a fury that could level buildings. He shouted orders, he broke glass, and he plotted the demise of men who shared his bloodline. Through it all, Nala moved with a discipline that was almost eerie. She was a shadow in a dark dress and a stark white apron, her movements so precise they seemed choreographed. She never startled when he slammed a fist onto the mahogany dining table. She never looked up when his security detail dragged a screaming informant through the foyer. To Min-jae, she was simple. A quiet, capable woman from a distant continent who likely understood only half of what she heard and cared for even less. He looked at her and saw a blank slate, a creature of routine who found peace in the steam of a hot iron and the methodical scrubbing of marble. He was wrong. Nala wasn't just cleaning, she was cataloging. As she wiped the dust from his bookshelves, she was memorizing the frequency of his breaths. As she refilled his crystal decanter, she was noting the slight tremor in his hand that told her he was being squeezed by an enemy he couldn't see. She saw the stress lines around his cold eyes and the way his neck tattoos rippled when he was truly afraid. She knew more about his empire than his own lieutenants did, simply because she was the only one in the room no one bothered to lie to. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Seoul skyline, casting the penthouse in dramatic, high-contrast shadows, Min-jae stood by the window, his reflection looking like a ghost over the city he was losing. He didn't hear Nala enter. He didn't hear her set the tray down. But for the first time, he felt a strange, cold prickle at the base of his neck, a sensation of being watched not by a servant, but by a peer. He turned to dismiss her, but Nala was already gone, leaving behind only the scent of fresh linen and a newspaper on the table, folded specifically to a page detailing a freak accident involving his rival's main financier. Min-jae stared at the paper, then at the empty hallway. He began to wonder if the ghost he had hired was starting to haunt him. But his curiosity was cut short by a sound that shouldn't have been there. The faint, rhythmic clicking of a lock being bypassed at the service entrance, a sound only a professional would catch, and one that Nala had heard 10 seconds before him. The rhythmic click of the service lock was a sound that meant death in Min-jae's world, but it was followed by a silence even more unsettling. He reached for the suppressed pistol hidden beneath the mahogany side table, his heart hammering a jagged beat against his ribs. He waited for the crash of boots, the shattered glass, the familiar roar of an ambush. Instead, there was only the soft, rhythmic thwack-thwack of fabric hitting a stone counter. Min-jae moved toward the laundry suite, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the marble floor. He rounded the corner, gun raised, only to find Nala standing before a mountain of white linens. She didn't flinch at the sight of the weapon. She didn't even look up. Her hands, dark and steady against the bleached cotton, moved with a terrifying grace, folding his shirts into perfect, sharp-edged squares. "Did you hear that?" Min-jae hissed, his eyes darting to the service door behind her. It was locked. Not forced, not scratched, bolted from the inside. Nala finally looked at him, her expression a mask of placid professionality. "The wind in the vents is quite loud tonight, sir. It often plays tricks on the ears." Min-jae lowered the gun, his brow furrowed. He felt like a fool, a paranoid king jumping at shadows. He retreated to his office, but the unease didn't leave him. It only deepened an hour later when his lead security detail, a man named Park who looked as though he had been carved from granite, burst into the room. Park wasn't just worried, he was shaken. "Boss, we have a problem," Park breathed. "Seoul, the Shin clan's lead lieutenant. The one who's been tailing your car for 3 weeks. He's gone." Min-jae leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. "Gone? You mean he retreated?" "No," Park said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "His car was found 3 blocks from here. The engine was still running. His phone, his weapon, even his shoes were still in the vehicle. But Seoul, it's like he evaporated into the Seoul fog. There's no blood. No struggle. No CCTV footage. He just stopped existing." Min-jae's mind raced. People in their world didn't just vanish without a mess. Disappearances required teams, vans, and struggles. They required noise. He looked past Park's shoulder into the hallway, where Nala was silently moving a rolling cart of fresh towels. She paused for a moment, her eyes meeting Min-jae's through the doorway. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply reached down and plucked a small, stray silver thread from her apron, a thread that looked remarkably like the high-end upholstery from a Shin clan sedan, and tucked it into her pocket before disappearing into the shadows of the West Wing. Min-jae felt a cold sweat break across his neck. He realized then that while his men were looking for an army, they should have been looking for a ghost. And the ghost was currently humming a low, wordless tune as she polished the silver, while the man who had been a threat to his life was now nothing more than a memory. The silence of the penthouse had never felt so heavy, and as Min-jae watched the security monitors, he saw a flicker of movement in the basement that made his blood run cold. The flickering monitor in the basement wasn't a glitch, it was a symptom. Min-jae watched the grainy feed, his jaw tight, as 2 of his most trusted guards huddled in the blind spot of the north corridor. They were whispering with the frantic energy of men who had already spent the silver they'd been promised for his head. Min-jae felt the familiar burn of betrayal, a heat that usually ended in a frantic, bloody confrontation. But before he could reach for his radio to order a lockdown, a dark shape drifted across the screen, not a person, but a smudge of shadow that seemed to swallow the light. Nala didn't walk into rooms, she occupied them. While Min-jae sat paralyzed by the tactical nightmare of a mutiny, Nala was already performing an audit. She moved through the penthouse with a spray bottle and a microfiber cloth, a silent observer of the micro-expressions his men couldn't hide. She saw the way the youngest guard, Kim, avoided her eyes, and how the veteran, Choi, kept his hand hovering too close to his holster whenever Min-jae's back was turned. To the guards, she was just a help, a background character in their conspiracy. They didn't realize that a woman who had survived the bush didn't need a wiretap to hear a lie. She could smell it in their sweat. By midnight, the audit was complete. Min-jae was startled by a soft tap on his office door. Nala stood there, her posture perfectly vertical, holding a small silver tray. On it sat a single, handwritten list and a USB drive she had found while vacuuming the tactical room. The upholstery in the surveillance suite was gathering quite a bit of dust, sir, she said, her voice a calm, low melody. I took the liberty of deep cleaning the hard drives as well. Min-jae stared at the list. It wasn't a shopping order. It was a list of names, sorted by the degree of their disloyalty, with timestamps of their secret communications. Below the names, she had noted the exact caliber of the weapons they had smuggled into his secure zone. His heart hammered. He was surrounded by vipers, and he had been too arrogant, too blinded by his own power, to see the fangs at his throat. He looked up to ask her how, but Nala was already kneeling by the floor-to-ceiling window, meticulously removing a smudge that didn't exist. Why are you telling me this, Nala? He asked, his voice raw. A clean house is a safe house, sir, she replied, never breaking her rhythm. And a house with this many leaks cannot stay dry for long. She stood up, her eyes finally locking onto his. For the first time, Min-jae didn't see a maid. He saw a mirror reflecting his own mortality. He realized then that Nala wasn't just auditing his staff, she was auditing him. The silence that followed was shattered by a sudden, muffled thud from the kitchen, the sound of a body hitting the floor with the unmistakable weight of finality. Min-jae's hand flew to his gun, but Nala simply adjusted her apron. That would be the first leak, sir, she whispered. I believe the others are currently making their way to the service elevator. Min-jae didn't wait for the service elevator to open. He surged toward the kitchen, his polished shoes skidding on the marble, his weapon drawn and leveled at the swinging double doors. He expected a tactical squad. He expected a firestorm. What he found was a nightmare of quiet efficiency. The kitchen was bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of industrial overheads. Choi, the veteran guard who had been on Min-jae's payroll for 6 years, was already on the ground, his eyes wide and vacant, a paring knife buried with surgical precision in the soft hollow of his throat. But it was the second man, Kim, who held Min-jae's gaze. Kim was a foot taller than Nala and twice her weight, his tactical vest bristling with hardware. He was reaching for his sidearm, his face contorted in a mask of panicked betrayal. Then Nala moved. It wasn't a fight. Not in any way Min-jae understood the word. There was no posturing, no wasted breath, no cinematic struggle. She became a blur of dark fabric and lethal intent. One moment she was standing by the center island with a damp cloth in her hand. The next, she was inside Kim's guard, her movements so fluid it defied the physics of the room. She didn't punch, she struck like a piston. Her palm caught Kim's chin, snapping his head back with a sickening crack, while her other hand gripped the wrist of his drawing arm, twisting it until the bones splintered. Min-jae froze, his finger trembling on the trigger of a gun that suddenly felt like a toy. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as Nala used Kim's own momentum to drive him face first into the edge of the stainless steel counter. She didn't let him fall. She caught him, easing his unconscious body to the floor with a gentleness that was more terrifying than the violence itself. It was the way one might set down a piece of fragile luggage. Silence reclaimed the kitchen, broken only by the hum of the industrial refrigerator. Nala stood over the two traitors, her breathing shallow but perfectly controlled. Not a single strand of her hair had fallen out of its neat bun. She reached out, took the damp cloth she had dropped on the island, and began to wipe a single droplet of blood from her white apron. "The service elevator has been disabled, sir," she said, her voice returning to that melodic, professional lilt. "But the rest of the team will be taking the stairs. We have approximately 90 seconds before they reach the landing." Min-jae looked at the bodies, then at the woman he had treated like an invisible servant for months. The angular lines of his face hardened as the reality sank in. He hadn't hired a maid. He had invited a predator into his home, and for the first time in his life, he realized he didn't know if he was the master of the house or merely the next thing on her list to be cleaned. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of heavy boots echoing in the stairwell cut him off. Nala didn't look at the door. She looked at him, her eyes dark and piercingly alert. "Sir," she whispered, "do you want to live, or do you want to ask questions?" The choice was hers as much as his, but as the door handle began to turn, Min-jae realized he had no idea what Nala had hidden in the drawers of his own kitchen. The adrenaline from the kitchen ambush hadn't even cooled before Min-jae found himself back in his office, the doors locked and his hand trembling as he bypassed his own security protocols. Nala was somewhere in the East Wing, presumably disposing of the trash she had collected, but the image of her movement, that predatory, inhuman blur, burned behind his eyelids. He needed to know what he was harboring. He needed to find the bottom of her. He pulled the encrypted laptop from his floor safe, his fingers dancing over the keys as he accessed the deep web databases only a man of his stature could reach. He started with her passport. It was a masterpiece of forgery or a ghost's truth. The numbers led to a dead-end server in Brussels that had been wiped clean 3 years ago. He moved to her fingerprints, cross-referencing them with Interpol, the CIA, and every black market mercenary registry from Johannesburg to Seoul. The screen blinked. No results found. Min-jae leaned back, the blue light of the monitor carving deep, skeletal shadows into his angular face. It was impossible. Everyone left a footprint. Even the most elite assassins had a trail of bodies, a whisper of a name, or a discarded alias. But Nala was a vacuum. No birth certificate existed for her in Africa, no school records, no medical history, no digital ghost of a bank account. It was as if she had stepped fully formed out of the ether and into his penthouse. His obsession, which had started as a dark curiosity, was curdling into a cold, sharp fear. He wasn't just dealing with a woman who knew how to fight. He was dealing with a black hole, a person whose entire existence had been systematically erased by a power far greater than his own syndicate. A soft floorboard creaked behind him. Min-jae spun around, his hand flying to the holster at his waist, but the room was empty. Only the heavy, velvet curtains swayed slightly in the draft of the air conditioner. He turned back to the screen and saw a new window open, one he hadn't clicked. It was a simple text file, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. "Are you looking for me, sir?" His breath hitched. He wasn't just being watched, he was being monitored in real time. He realized with a jolt of terror that every camera he used to survey his empire was likely feeding back to her. He was the king of a glass castle, and she was the one who knew exactly where to strike to make it shatter. A faint, metallic scent began to waft through the vents, the smell of ozone and wet copper. It was the scent of a storm breaking. Just as he moved to shut the laptop, the power in the building groaned. The monitors flickered once, twice, and then went pitch black. In the sudden, suffocating darkness, Min-jae heard the soft, unmistakable sound of a white apron rustling just inches from his ear. "It's rude to stare at a lady's private business, Min-jae," a voice whispered, no longer melodic, but sharp as a razor. The darkness in the office was absolute, a heavy velvet weight that pressed against Min-jae's lungs. He didn't move. He didn't reach for his weapon. Experience told him that by the time he felt her breath on his skin, she had already decided whether he would live to see the dawn. The blue light of the laptop died away, leaving only the faint, rhythmic glow of the city skyline far below, casting Nala's silhouette in sharp, jagged silver. "Who are you?" Min-jae asked, his voice a low rasp that betrayed the terror gnawing at his composure. "I am the woman who keeps your floors clean, sir," Nala replied. The "sir" was still there, but the subservience had evaporated, replaced by a cold, level authority that made the hair on his arms stand up. "I checked the files," Min-jae countered, turning slowly to face the shadow. "You don't exist. There is no Nala." There is no record of a woman with your face in any corner of this world. You are a ghost, and ghosts don't work for minimum wage in the house of a man with a target on his back." The silence stretched, long and agonizing, until a small, metallic click echoed in the room. A lighter flared. In the tiny, dancing flame, Min-jae saw her face. She wasn't holding a gun, she was holding a candle she had plucked from his dining table. Her eyes weren't filled with the bloodlust of an assassin or the greed of an informant. They were tired. They were filled with the ancient, heavy fatigue of someone who had seen the end of the world and survived it. "You think I'm here for your money? Your secrets?" She stepped closer, the candlelight flickering across her deep brown skin. "I've spent 15 years in places where names are a liability and a heartbeat is a luxury. I've been a weapon for men far more powerful and far more cruel than you, Min-jae. I didn't come to Seoul to join your war. I came here because your house was the only place I could find where the silence was loud enough to drown out the noise in my head." Min-jae felt the air leave his chest. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't an infiltrator. She was a refugee of a different kind of conflict. She had chosen his home because a Mafia boss's penthouse was the only place a professional killer could hide in plain sight. She wasn't his servant, he was her camouflage. "You're not here to kill me," he breathed, a strange, hysterical relief washing over him. "No," Nala whispered, leaning in so close he could see the amber flecks in her dark eyes. "But the men who are coming for you are the same men I spent my life running from. And they just cut the power to the main grid." The floor beneath them shivered. A dull, distant thud vibrated through the steel skeleton of the skyscraper, the sound of the backup generators being sabotaged. Nala blew out the candle, plunging them back into a void that smelled of smoke and impending slaughter. "They aren't here for your ledger anymore, Min-jae." Her voice drifted through the blackness. "They're here because they finally found me." The penthouse didn't just go dark, it became a tomb. Without the hum of the climate control and the steady pulse of the security monitors, the air grew thick and stagnant. Outside, the shimmering lights of Seoul were masked by a sudden, driving rain, leaving the floor-to-ceiling windows to reflect nothing but the hollow terror in Min-jae's eyes. From the floors below, the sounds of the panic began, shouts of confused guards, the frantic clatter of boots on marble, and then, the first suppressed thud of a body hitting the floor. "Stay behind the desk," Nala's voice commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a tactical directive. Min-jae crouched in the shadows, his lungs burning with shallow breaths. He heard the office doors slide open, not with a bang, but with a predatory smoothness. 3 silhouettes framed against the dim gray light of the hallway stepped inside, their night vision goggles glowing like the eyes of deep-sea monsters. These weren't Shin Clan thugs. These were specialists, moving in a tight, lethal formation that spoke of years of state-sponsored training. They never saw her. Nala didn't just move in the dark, she owned it. She was a ghost made of obsidian, a whisper of silk that struck before the ear could even register the sound. The lead operative suddenly jerked upward, his feet leaving the floor as if pulled by an invisible wire. There was a wet, muffled snap, and he was dropped like a sack of grain. The second man swung his rifle toward the sound, the infrared beam cutting a desperate, jagged line through the dark, but Nala was already below his guard. Min-jae watched, paralyzed, as Nala became a god of war. She used the dark as a physical weapon, appearing and disappearing in the strobe light flashes of suppressed gunfire. She didn't use a gun. She used a silver letter opener she'd taken from his desk and the brutal, physics-defying momentum of her own body. She moved with a terrifying, rhythmic economy: strike, pivot, kill. Strike, pivot, kill. The room smelled of cordite and copper. In less than 20 seconds, the 3 professionals were gone, reduced to heaps of tactical gear and cooling flesh. Nala stood in the center of the carnage, her chest rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic cadence. She reached up and wiped a splash of something hot from her cheek, her eyes catching a stray glint of lightning from the storm outside. The building is compromised from the basement to the roof, she whispered, her voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. My old life has finally caught up to your front door, Min-jae. And they brought enough thermite to bring this whole tower down. Before he could respond, the emergency red lights flickered to life, bathing the room in a bloody, rhythmic pulse. On the wall of monitors, Min-jae saw the lobby doors vanish in a cloud of fire. The real invasion had begun, and as the elevator cables began to scream, he realized that Nala wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the security hub. Go to the monitor room, she ordered, handing him a fallen operative's radio. If you want to survive the next 10 minutes, you have to stop being a boss and start being my eyes. The red emergency lights pulsed like a dying heartbeat, painting the corridors in strobing slashes of crimson. Min-jae scrambled into the monitor room, his fingers flying over the manual overrides. For years he had sat in this chair to watch his wealth grow or his enemies suffer, but now, the screens showed a different reality. Thermal signatures were blooming in the stairwells like a spreading virus. The Shin clan's turncoats were merging with the foreign shadows Nala had feared, a combined force of greed and professional vengeance. Stairwell B for men. Min-jae's voice crackled through the radio, his tone sharpening from panic into a cold, tactical clarity. They're setting charges on the load-bearing columns. If those blow, the east wing drops. I need them in the open. Nala's voice came back, calm and detached, as if she were discussing the afternoon tea. Give them a reason to run. Min-jae didn't hesitate. He bypassed the fire suppression protocols, venting a cloud of localized CO2 into the stairwell, while simultaneously triggering the emergency sirens in the opposite corridor. The distraction worked. The signatures on his screen scattered, coughing and disoriented, spilling out into the wide, exposed expanse of the gallery. Then, Nala descended. From the monitor, Min-jae saw her move like a glitch in the software. She dropped from a ventilation duct, a silhouette of absolute lethal intent. He didn't just watch, he participated. 6 o'clock, Nala! The one in the gray vest has a serrated blade. He slammed the button to seal the heavy glass partitions, trapping the last 2 operatives in a kill box. Nala didn't thank him. She simply executed. She used the environment Min-jae provided, the shifting doors, the blinding security strobes, the redirected gas, to dismantle the squad with the precision of a master clockmaker. He provided the chaos, she provided the conclusion. For the first time, the power dynamic in the penthouse wasn't master and servant, nor was it predator and prey. They were a single machine, a blend of Mafia infrastructure and elite erasure. As the last thermal signature on the gallery floor faded to a cold blue, Min-jae leaned back, gasping for air. His tailored jacket was ruined, his hands were slick with sweat, but he felt a strange, dark electricity hum through his veins. They were winning. It's clear, he panted into the radio. Nala, the gallery is clear. There was no response. Only a static-filled hiss. Min-jae's eyes darted back to the screens. A new window was forced open on the center monitor, bypassing his controls. It wasn't a camera feed. It was a live broadcast from the penthouse roof. A man stood there, his face obscured by a tactical mask, holding a remote detonator in one hand and Nala's discarded white apron in the other. Min-jae. A voice boomed through the monitor room speakers. You've played a very clever game. But the maid isn't the only one who knows how to hide in the dark. Min-jae looked at the service elevator feed. The doors were opening. And Nala was nowhere to be seen. The silence that followed the final explosion on the roof was the heaviest the penthouse had ever known. The masked man was gone, his remote detonator a twisted piece of scrap metal at the bottom of the Han River, and the Shin clan had been reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the backrooms of Seoul. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the shattered glass of the estate in hues of bruised purple and gold, Min-jae stood on the helipad, his chest heaving. He looked at Nala. She was standing by the edge, the wind whipping her dark dress, her face as unreadable as the day he had hired her. They're gone. Min-jae said, his voice cracking with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. The Shin clan, the specialists, everyone who knew your name. Nala didn't turn. She watched the city wake up, her eyes reflecting the cold, distant light. Names are like shadows, Min-jae. They eventually catch up to you when the sun gets low enough. Min-jae walked toward her, stepping over the debris of his old life. The fear he had felt for her was gone, replaced by a profound, dangerous respect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold key, the key to his private vault and a symbol of total executive power. I don't want a maid anymore, Nala. My inner circle is empty. There is a seat at my table for you. No more laundry, no more floors. You'd be the shadow behind the throne. My equal. Nala finally turned, her gaze landing on the gold key and then drifting to his face. For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched her lips, not one of joy, but of a woman who knew a secret the rest of the world had forgotten. I've sat at tables in palaces and war rooms, Min-jae. The chairs are never comfortable, and the food always tastes like copper, she said softly. She reached out and pushed his hand away, closing his fingers over the gold key. I decline the seat. Min-jae's brow furrowed. Then what? You're leaving? No, Nala replied, her voice regaining that melodic, professional lilt. I like the silence of this house. And I like the way you take your espresso. I will stay. We will be partners. You handle the noise of the city, and I will handle the mess that follows you. But we do it on my terms. She stepped past him, her shoulder brushing his in a gesture that was more intimate than a kiss and more binding than a blood oath. The contract is simple. I remain invisible. I am the maid. No one looks at me, no one questions me, and most importantly. She paused at the door, her eyes flashing with a restrained, lethal menace. No one ever touches my mop. Min-jae watched her walk back into the penthouse, the sun catching the white of her apron one last time. He realized then that he hadn't just survived a war. He had entered into a new kind of world entirely. He was still the boss of Seoul, but his empire was now built on the quietest foundation on earth. As he followed her in, he noticed a new stain on the marble foyer, a stray drop of blood from his own hand. Before he could even think to call for help, Nala was already there, kneeling with a cloth and a spray bottle, her movements precise and hypnotic. The house was clean. The city was quiet. But as Min-jae looked at the woman at his feet, he knew the real story was only just beginning.